VC firms in the country. She focuses on early-stage investments across a wide range of industries, with technology as a unifying theme. She has particular interest in software as service, analytics, consumer products, food, and developer tools. She's also a former developer turned product manager for venture-backed startups and media companies like the New York Times, which helped launch video and multimedia vertical and manage the video player on the homepage, and we'll get a chance to talk a little bit about that. And before joining Founder Collective, she founded and ran a NetTech assessment and analytics company, which aimed to provide an alternative to standardized testing. She's also a lecturer on data analytics at Northeastern University and is deeply involved in the startup ecosystem here in Boston and in building support networks for entrepreneurs at every level. So please join me in welcoming Parul tonight. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you.
Great. So it's also a tradition to start talking with our guests a little bit about their background. Where did you grow up? Where do you go to school? And how you get interested in entrepreneurship, whether it's something that started in childhood. So let's start just there.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here tonight. I'm really excited to kind of get to know a little bit about you and tell you a little bit about my path through entrepreneurship into venture. I was born in Nigeria, moved with my family to the U.S. when I was 5. And we ended up after settling in the Boston area. So I actually grew up in the south suburbs of Boston. Went to college and grad school here at Harvard and then MIT for business school. And in between those two school episodes in Cambridge, spent about 8 years in New York City working for different media companies most of the time. So that's a little bit about geographically where I started. As far as my interest in entrepreneurship, I definitely didn't think when I was in high school that I was going to be an entrepreneur. I really loved creative things. That was really how I kind of came to it. I learned how to code in high school, which I think is something that was incredibly helpful for me later. And I think it is one of the reasons I think it's so important to. Does it not work? I learned how to code in high school, which is one of the reasons I think it's so important for kids to get that skill set super early. And really, but the first time that I realized I was potentially headed in that direction, when I was in college, I started out pre-med. Was completely convinced that I wanted to be a doctor. Except I had this little nagging thought in the back of my head that, I hated hospitals. And so I knew that wasn't really going to work, but I was still kind of very gung-ho, I'm going to, be, that's what I thought I was headed towards until I got to college and basically came to terms with this and started thinking about what I would do instead. And I really explored, at first I became a government and policy major, and I did everything possible to kind of explore what would it be like to go to law school, because I was from a very traditional Indian family where, you have to do something with a grad degree involved. If you're not going to be a doctor or an engineer, law school is sort of the third option. And I worked for my city councilor in Cambridge. I did public policy internships. I worked on Capitol Hill. And I basically talked to a bunch of lawyers, and every single lawyer that I talked to hated it. So this was another little warning sign. And then I didn't know what I wanted to do. So I decided at the encouragement of the director of career services at Harvard, who was incredibly supportive and was a mentor to me at the time, to take a year off and work. And I didn't really know what I was going to do. It was very open-ended. But I wrote 50 letters to Harvard alums in London. I had some relatives there, so I knew I would have a cheap landing spot when I got there. And it turned out that the only thing I could really get a job doing in a different country was using this skill set that I had learned in high school of coding. So I ended up first building databases for a big, kind of really boring management consulting company. And the nice thing was that I sort of got a chance to play around with the software, and I totally, the company was, I can't even describe like how boring the company was. Like, I'm not going to name any names, and I don't think it's anywhere in my public record, so I'm not embarrassing them. But, everyone had worked there for like 50 years. I was 19. I was by far like 50 years younger than everyone else that I worked with. And so I basically just sat around all day and like I played with making this database. This sounds like really boring, but I loved designing it. I loved like kind of putting together this interface, and I realized that this was like really fun and I wanted to do this. After I was there for about half a year, the guy that I worked for, I had added every single feature I could possibly think of adding to this database for the business development team of this company, and they were kind of running out of stuff for me to do. So he was like, well, I'm an investor in this startup, and they really need a database, so why don't you go and work for them? And I ended up working for this lunatic guy who was so like crazy and awesome. He was a sailor on the British national sailing team. And just to give you an idea, every year on July 4th, he would come to the US and challenge American sailors to a race. Okay, so he was like really out there, and he was just like high energy, and his company was a remote call answering service. So England had just gotten the technology for you to be able to route your phone calls to someone else's phone. So he basically was recruiting people who would stay at home and answer your phone calls for you. And I designed a system to capture all the call logs of all of the, so that you could capture phone calls and then share them with the person who they were supposed to be for. And it was so much fun. Like, it was this tiny office in like this small town in England, but just the team, everyone was like so passionate about what they were doing, very focused, very specialized to like doing that specific thing. And it was such a big contrast. I knew still that the work that I was doing I really liked. Like, I liked being the person who was building something on the team. But I also just kind of got the bug that like he was building something where like there really had been nothing before. It was a really interesting year, but I came back and I knew that at some point I wanted to start something or be involved with startups again. A long answer to
Perfect.
your question.
So talk a little bit about
After that, your first work experiences, was there something you've worked in
design of interfaces. You
programming, so can you talk a little bit
about those first jobs and how what did you learn there that was meaningful?
Sure. Well, my first job after I graduated, I sort of continued after that with development. I was an interface developer. I actually worked in that, like, one of the next buildings over, like 101 Main, I think, the one that's right on the water, for a firm called Razorfish. It was one of the first digital agencies. They built a ton of the websites in the first, before the first .com crash. And it was amazing. Like, all the people that I worked with were very specialized. So there were people who, the designers had all gone to school for understanding users, and they had really formal processes for kind of vetting. How do you build an interface for someone? How do you test it? How do you kind of evolve it? What's a brand, like a style guideline? Like, how do you document style guidelines? It was a great place to kind of learn about how do you build complex software. Part of that was also because the Cambridge office was the acquisition of a company, a Boston-based systems integration company. So there were a lot of really technical people in the office who I also learned a lot from. Unfortunately, it was also kind of the year of the .com crash. So I graduated, there were 35 people who were hired with me, and like about 10 months in, 32 of them had been laid off, and the other two besides me who hadn't were both MBAs. And so I was just like I was really nervous about losing my job, and I ended up leaving and going somewhere else. But it was such a great experience, and it was too bad that I wish I had been able to stay for longer.
Great. And you then went into media companies and video. Can you talk a little bit about that? And then you shifted towards investment, or working with Founder Collective.
From software or
Design, then video.
and then to the venture?
Sure. So I think when I went to New York, I was just really, when I first moved, I actually still, I knew I liked programming and building stuff, but in my heart, I really actually wanted to be a novelist. I'm in some ways, I feel like I'm the accidental VC, because I definitely didn't start out on a path to get to where I am, but sort of fortuitous, sort of followed things up where I am today, and doing what I'm doing, which I really love as well. I initially got a job working for a magazine and running their tech team. I wanted to sort of, I wanted to go from being a front-end developer to kind of learning more about the back-end and full-stack development, and so was sort of running like the guts of the systems that ran our website and our publishing systems. While I was at Incan in the hello, can you guys hear me? Okay. In the 2.5 years while I was there, the ownership of the magazines changed, I think, twice, and my team had to change over all of the systems that we were using 3 times. So basically, I got there, I had to learn all these systems, and then we did a giant software migration, and we moved everything to a different system. And then 6 months later, we did the same thing, and then 8 months later, we did the same thing again. And so it was a little bit like, after a while, I felt that I didn't want to be on the technical side anymore. I kind of wanted to be on the side where you got to decide what you were going to use and why, and instead of just sort of blindly doing this. So I, had been interviewing for project and I was running the tech team that I worked in at that point, and was sort of recruited into a position at the New York Times doing product management. So made a shift that way into. It was a really interesting time to be at the newspaper. They were sort of struggling to figure out, and I think still are in a challenging position trying to figure out what happens as the business model that worked for them for many centuries basically evaporated underneath them. And they were investing heavily in digital and online, and so was part of a product team that basically had divided up the paper into all these different verticals. So there was a technology product manager, there was a search product manager, there was an arts and entertainment product manager. So there were sort of content and then also types of content. I ended up becoming the person working on video and multimedia, partly because my technical background meant that I was going to be able to handle all of it's a little more complicated than just some of the content areas. So that's sort of the path, and but what I learned there, I really got to learn about product management from a group of people who had incredibly varied backgrounds. And I think that being a product manager in a really big organization it was a pretty amazing experience, because I had a P&L for the sort of business areas that I was running, and I got to, as a product manager, you end up kind of, you don't necessarily, people don't report to you, but you're responsible for an outcome. And so many people have described it as a product manager being like a CEO. Well, except as a CEO, people actually report to you. But you have to kind of convince people you need to set direction, and you have to convince people to kind of build what you think they should build and why, and build a business model around it, and get all of these different pieces organized around a goal. So from your engineering team to when you're rolling something out, like the QA and the customer support, to the ad sales people, or they're just all these different pieces. So kind of learning how to get them all in order, I think, was one of the big things. The New York Times at the time, I mean, just so people understand sort of like the magnitude of the problem, the Times when I was there had maybe 20 million or 30 million, somewhere between like maybe 20, 25 million monthly visitors to its website. And it had 1 million print subscribers. And it made the same amount of money or more on the print subscribers than it did from the digital subscribers. And that's because just online advertising is a terrible business. And because for many, many years, what Craigslist does now is where newspapers actually made their money. And so then once Craigslist happened, or after Craigslist was born, it basically took away one of the biggest sources of revenue for newspapers. So they had to try and figure out what to do. And they weren't necessarily oriented around being digital. And so there were all these sort of challenges in trying to like rebuild this ship that they were on that was sort of sinking. And I'm not sure how far I can go with this metaphor. But I mean, it was just a very challenging time. I think that the publishing industry is kind of in the same place of trying to figure that out. And so it was, there were a lot of really hard problems to solve. I got to work on, there were really cool initiatives that they were willing to try, and the quality of the journalists and the content and everyone there was just amazing. So that was also like another reason that it's sometimes amazing to be, I actually encourage aspiring entrepreneurs to spend some time in a bigger company because it's the place that you're most likely to actually have structured learning because there's just so many people around you to learn from. So it was a wonderful experience.
So how do you transition from that to starting your own company?
Well, I definitely knew I wanted to start my own company, and while I was at the Times, I was meeting with a lot of startups. We were trying to figure out we were always experimenting, and a lot of startups would pitch us. I really clicked with one of them. I have a tendency to sort of give a lot of feedback to people who are using products, or who give a lot of feedback when I try a product. And this company pitched me, and I said to them, well, I really like your product, but I wish it did all these other things. And I gave them like a really long list. And a couple months later, they came back to me and they were like, if you ever decide to leave, we would really like to hire you. And I ended up going there eventually and coming back to Boston to work for them. I felt like it was a great opportunity to, the product I was working on at the Times wasn't making a lot of money. And so it was, I thought that, well, here's a chance to I still had that startup itch. And so I thought, well, here's a chance to go work for a really early stage company and kind of learn the ropes there and make a contribution on a much smaller team. So I ended up doing that and coming back to Boston.
And how do you come up with the idea of a net tech company? How did that happen?
I was obsessed with education for a couple of years around then. Like, I love to try edtech products. I'll sign up for things. I mean, in general, I just love trying new things as new products. I always sign up for 1 billion of them. My sister, who happens to be here, knows that I also push them upon everyone around me, which can be, because I love trying new stuff and I try new everything. And for a while, I was just going through this phase where I also love learning. And I was trying all these different edtech products, and so experimenting with them. And so just thinking about like what's out there, what's not out there. I sort of felt that I got more involved in the startup ecosystem in Boston because knowing in the back of my mind that I was really interested in education and I really wanted to start something, but without a specific idea. I ended up becoming really involved I met a lot of other entrepreneurs through something called the Startup Leadership Program, which is a fellowship program that still is running in Boston. And basically it had between 14 to 20 entrepreneurs or aspiring entrepreneurs in a group, and we would meet once a month and just get drinks and have speakers like this come in and talk to us. And as I listened to more and more of these entrepreneurs come in, I just knew that that was me. You know, like they would just talk about loving to create stuff, or having that same itch, or seeing products and knowing how they wanted them to be different. I just felt, I was more convinced that that was the path I wanted to go down. I still didn't have an idea. So I ended up running that program and staying at the startup I was in. And I decided to go back to grad school to sort of just learn more and meet people. The two co-founders of the startup that I worked for had gone to MIT Sloan. And so they described it to me as a very entrepreneurial focused business school. Like that was the sense that I got. They had so many friends. They were in the same class as Brian Halligan and Dharmesh Shah, and there were a bunch of other startups. The Okta founders, I think, were in their class or right around them too. So there were a couple of really successful startups that had come out of Sloan around that time. So I ended up there. And I knew that I sort of immersed myself in the startup scene, if there was one, at MIT when I was there. I met another student pretty early on, like within the first week, who, and this just I think reflects how much my friends and other students that I knew, one of my friends was like, oh, you want to do something in education startups? There's this other guy in our class who wants to do something in education startups. And so we ended up talking, and he was a former developer. We had a lot of overlapping skills, which actually, I think in retrospect, wasn't the best thing, but he was a great developer, and we started brainstorming for ideas like pretty much right away. I ended up at Founder Collective more related to the fact that I was sort of very immersed in startups than because I was aiming for a venture job. I actually had helped a classmate of mine prep. One of my friends wanted to go work for a startup, and I helped him prep for an interview with the startup that he wanted to go intern for, and he got the job. And then later, he actually got 2 VC internships for the summer. And he was going to take one of them, and he recommended to the guys I work for now that they should hire me for the one that he didn't take. So it's such a funny, the introduction was so funny. And I was just like, I had heard of the firm that I worked for, and I thought they were really, they'd worked on really interesting startups, but it wasn't so much that a lot of people, I think, go into investing with a lot of finance background or sort of planning it that way. And for me, it was more just the love of startups that kind of brought me there. So I ended up working there for about a year while I was in grad school. It's funny, I had the idea, and I was still brainstorming with my co-founder. We actually came up with the idea for Gradable, like, the Friday before I started my internship at the VC firm. We had been talking to all the teachers we could find, and we'd sort of did our brainstorming in a couple of ways. So we wrote down like gaming, analytics, and like something else, like assessment, I think, on the board. And then we started talking to teachers, and we basically asked them, like, what do you hate the most about your job? And like, or what would make your job easier? And what do you kind of hate the most about it? And the first person I asked, at literally the first question that I asked, said that the thing that she hated the most about her job was grading. And she didn't have to think about it. And in fact, she said, I hated grading so much that I was a teacher for 10 years and I quit because I hate grading. And I was like, wow, well, that's like a, intense reaction. But, when you're doing user interviews, the first one is not supposed to be the one that like kind of tells you what you obviously keep going at that point. So I was like, okay, well, that's like a really strong reaction, but I'll continue talking to people and see what happens. And all the other teachers I talked to had basically said the same thing. And I learned also that many of them had all these workarounds for avoiding grading their students' work. And a lot of times, the workarounds meant that they graded less of the students' work. So teachers wouldn't grade homework every day. So to me, like, grading is just a way of kind of taking a snapshot of how kids are doing, right? Like, how are you doing at this moment in time? And it's annoying, but it's super useful, and it has like a really immense value to you in understanding whether they understood what it's your feedback loop. So in teachers avoiding it, that was a big problem, I thought. So I ended up working with my co-founder on like trying to find a way to make grading a lot easier for teachers in a way that would allow them to not have to do like, I mean, basically the other like big theme is that we were thinking about was that everyone here took the SATs, right? And it basically sucks, right? And I mean, there's literally nothing good about it, almost, that I can think of. I'm not sure. One of my friends in the back is really much more versed in, works for Boston Public Schools, so I hope I'm not saying anything, any sacred cows, but I doubt it. But I don't think anyone really has anything good to say about standardized testing, but the only reason that we still do it is because it's the only way to get that snapshot of how kids are doing at any given point in time. So we basically built a system to let you get that data about students, but from any kind of format, so that kids could do a project, or they could do a portfolio, or they could do an essay, or write a proof or a poem, and teachers be able to like quickly grade it and give feedback on it and have it be related to standards, so that you get a lot of the benefits of standardized testing, but without the bubble sheet, or like without the like, you know, multiple choice thing. So that was basically what we ended up building, and I was working at Founder Collective for a while, basically while I had the idea, and then at a certain point right before I graduated, took the leap and started working on it, and ended up doing it full-time after we graduated.
And then you spent some time with a startup and then came back to Founder Collective. Talk about that and what made you decide to go full on to what you're doing now, which is really on the investment side, helping startups.
Well, it was a challenging time, I think, because we had for 2.5 years. So I mean, anyone who knows about the education market knows that schools don't have a lot of money, and it takes them a long time to buy software. And so for 2 years, actually 2.5 years, we tried to avoid this by making our product and going straight to teachers. But what ended up happening was that our product, we found product market fit selling to schools. And we iterated a whole bunch of times. We had some amazing wins. I mean, our first big customer, we got a national contract with Teach for America, and we got but then it just wasn't something that teachers would buy. And that's a little bit like, you wouldn't buy, if you work in an office, like you wouldn't pay for your own like accounting system. And that's a little bit how teachers thought about it. I think teachers buy products that help them engage with their students. They don't necessarily buy things that are focused on measuring how their students are doing. So we ended up, we sort of, I think the challenging thing was that at the very end, we sort of found product market fit. We got our first big district. And everything was going really well, but we were running out of money and time and energy, basically. So it wasn't, in needing to sell to schools, that meant that we were going to have to, even when everything went well with our first big district, it took us 14, 16 months to get a contract. And that was a killer. So it was a really tough decision, but it wasn't going to grow quickly enough for it to be a sustainable business for us. We hadn't planned well enough that we would need to outlast that sales cycle, because the whole time we've been thinking that we wouldn't need to do that. And so we basically I hired someone to kind of do sales, and we stopped doing product development, and we tried to see if we could grow with a little bit more from there. But I was at the point where we were getting ready to sort of shut it down. It was a really hard decision. I ended up, while we were thinking about it, I started teaching data analytics. And while I actually had 2 children in that last amount of time as well. And was thinking about what I wanted to do next, and Eric, who I had worked for, reached out to me and told me that they were looking for someone full-time and sort of invited me to come back and interview. So I did.
That's Eric Bailey,
Yeah.
the founder of Founder Collective.
Yeah, so he reached out to me, and so I ended up talking to them and deciding to go back. And I mean, really, it was about getting to work with Eric and David, and it's a really small, I work on a really small team. There are 4 of us on the investing team. And it was just the chance to get to work with them, pretty much. Like, I respect what they've done so much in terms of the investments, but they're also, as well as being some of the smartest people I know, are also just like some of the nicest and most generous and high integrity people I know. And so the chance to kind of get to learn from them was one I didn't feel I could pass up.
So talk a little bit about seed funding, and the difference between that and angel investment. That might not be obvious for everybody in the room, and why the focus on seed investment? Why early? And your experience with that?
Sure. So I'll talk a little bit about my firm's philosophy on this, right? So I think people naturally gravitate towards different stages of companies, right? There's some people who they love big companies and they belong there. And there are other people who really love the very, very beginning part of starting something. If you spend time around startups, you'll, I think, eventually get to know what stage you like the most. My partners at Founder Collective, they liked the early part. And I think they have a set of instincts around commercial viability that helped them sort of judge or look at or evaluate business models for really early stage companies and decide what they wanted to place bets on. It's a very different thing to do early stage investing than later stage investing. Like, it's completely different. I mean, when you have a company that's 5 years old or 6 years old, you have years of spreadsheets and numbers and stuff to look at. When I'm looking at an early stage company, sometimes I don't have to look at a spreadsheet because they're that early. Like, they have no metrics. Like, they just started or they haven't launched yet. The reason that we focus on seed is because it's a way to be in that spot of helping early stage companies along. And so I think that's that. Seed, the difference between seed and angel, well, angel investors are usually individuals. They can write a check anywhere from $5,000 to $500,000. I haven't heard of a lot of angels doing more than that, but they are usually individuals who are not necessarily, they might not be doing it full time. And they're individuals. So, and they're usually investing their own money. Seed investors, I would describe it, I mean, they're usually part of a organized, like an institutional venture fund. A lot of times they have investors who are giving them their money to invest, sometimes in addition to their own money. A lot of it is about stage. Angel investors in writing smaller checks, they tend to be more experimental. A lot of times the companies that I see and that we fund have gotten angel funding or founder funding or friends and family funding before they get to us. What seed is, I think, has changed a lot in the last 5 years. 5 out of the last 10 deals that I worked on probably would have been called an A like 5 or 7 years ago. So some of the characteristics of 5 out of the last 10 deals I worked on, repeat entrepreneurs who have been in market for like anywhere from 6 months to 18 months. They have a product. They have their first set of customers, anywhere from 5 to 500. So they've shown that they can do some level of user acquisition. And they haven't figured out everything. Like, they have some questions or hypotheses that they still need to answer, but they have ideas about them. And they know what metrics they're sort of tracking. Basically, they're ready to scale. Now, I'm pretty sure that 10 years ago that was an A. We do earlier stage stuff. We did Periscope before it launched, which later got acquired by Twitter. We've definitely done earlier stage stuff, but I think that seed is sort of, I was talking to someone earlier and about the dynamic, and it basically, our firm probably looks at 100 to 150 companies a month and invests in 2 of them, maybe 3. So it just becomes a question of metrics. So the companies that are more sophisticated or that are sort of proven out more, in many cases are the most competitive out of that, like they're the top 2 out of that 100 or 150. We definitely do try to do earlier stage stuff, but we'll like write a smaller check, not get on the board. And so that, I hope that's some general stuff about seed funding. One last thing I'll say is that there were no seed funds before like maybe 8 years ago. We were one of the first, and now I think there are about 500. So that's changed a lot, and as well.
Great. So are there any, you mentioned a bunch of characteristics of what you're investing on now, but maybe talk a little bit about what you look for in a startup. It can be anything from the team or the technology, but what's a deal breaker for you? Like you said, okay, we're going to invest in them. What are some of the things that people that are listening should be paying attention, putting their efforts on to make sure that they're attractive to a seed fund?
Well, I think one thing to remember is that we're investing in a business, not a product. So we want to know that we're looking for proof points along that dimension. Like, what are you going to sell this for? How long? There's sometimes like structural things about the market that make it really challenging. EdTech is actually an area where that is often the case. But there's some markets where you always have a 2-year sales cycle. That means that requires a different amount of funding. There's some areas that that just require a lot more capital to get going, like gaming or something like that. We're not so much sector specific. We're very opportunistic about what we look at. We do pretty much technology across the board. Someone asked me this earlier, and I ended up talking about, I mean, it's all important, right? Like team, your product, the market that you're in, and sort of your metrics. Like, you can't not, I mean, maybe you could have 3 out of 4 of them, but then the 3 that you have would have to be really outstanding because, well, it's just super competitive to get funded. So I think you do have to sort of be an all-around player. If you have a serious weakness in one area, it just means you're not going to be as competitive. So I think that's something. I think that one big piece of advice I would give people is that when you're thinking about, a lot of people are familiar with sort of the lean startup model, and I think that one spin on it that even though I was really involved in like sort of founding a lean startup competition in Boston, one thing I think I wasn't thinking about when I started my company was that you're not looking to prove out a need for what you are building. You're trying to prove out your business model. It's a very subtle difference, but it means that who's going to pay for this? How long is it going to take them to decide? And that there is actually someone who's willing to write a check for you for what you do is super important as you even decide whether to spend time on something. So that not so much about getting funded, but I think that, so what we specifically look for as a firm, we really care a lot about founder alignment. So founders who have an emotional connection or like some kind of history with the problem that makes them unique in being able to understand that area. Markets are another thing that I think people don't necessarily, like a lot of entrepreneurs, myself included, I loved education, and I think that it was much more of a mission for me than necessarily like a strategic choice to choose education as the place where I would make the most money. It definitely wasn't that. But thinking about markets is super important because for a lot of funds, they'll simply look at what market you're in and make a decision about, like, that's the first thing they're going to look at. Like, what market are you in? And not like, you know, this is a clean tech company, we like it or we don't like it. They're going to try to look at the specific solution that you're offering and whether they think it can be a certain size company. And if they don't think that, it's not a fit for them. And that's usually the first qualifier. And I don't think it's one that enough people know about.
Great. So maybe talk a little bit about some of the most common mistakes or needs that you see in early stage or seed companies. Some of the things you maybe just touched upon, but from the other side, what are some of the mistakes that you see that are more often done by founders or needs that are outstanding?
Okay. I'm going to frame this as sort of advice that we give entrepreneurs. So our fund tries to be, all of us are founders. Every single person on the team has founded a company. And we really try to make it our mission to be founder aligned and to sort of tell founders the truth. And, you know, like, we'll tell founders not to take too much money. And actually, a lot of VCs won't say that, because if you have a $700 million fund, you actually have to, you sort of have a perverse incentive to try to, if you like something, to give them a lot of money, so that, which sounds like a really good thing, to give them as much money as you can and buy as much of the company as you can, in order to make your investment worthwhile, right? Like, from their perspective, it makes total sense. But for you as an entrepreneur, there are a couple of negative things about it. It doesn't sound bad at all on the surface, right? Somebody wants to write me as big a check as they possibly can. Sounds awesome. It's much better for you as an entrepreneur if that person who's writing you as big a check as you possibly can is a customer in some cases, because you end up being in control of your own destiny. And one of the traps, I think, about valuations and sort of the, wow, my startup is valued at $10 million or $50 million. I mean, I'll just walk you through a scenario. So if you are, say, a startup and you've been around for a year, you've got a bunch of customers, your early customers, you're making 1.8 million in revenue right now from your first year or two of customers, and you get 2 term sheets. You get one term sheet which gives you, say, $5 million at a $15 million valuation. You get another term sheet which offers you $10 million at a $30 million valuation. You are giving away the same amount of your company, right? You're giving away a third of your company, and a lot of people might instinctively be like, wow, I could get 10 million. 10 million sounds awesome. Like, what could we do? Imagine the office we could have for $10 million. But when you do that, you're setting up a set of expectations for yourself as an entrepreneur. You're setting up the expectation that your startup, by the time you run out of money, or by the time you need to raise your next amount of funding, you're going to be able to increase your value from $30 million to $50 million, or no one else is going to give you money after that. So you have a cliff. If, on the other hand, you went for the 15 million, you have to raise your money, you have to raise your value from, your next round needs to be worth more to the investors than 15 million. So it's a little bit of a lower bar to set for yourself. And sometimes startups get into that trap that they can't get their no one wants to fund them at that next round because they made some growth, but they didn't make this much growth. That's, I think, one of the hardest things that happens. Another piece of advice that we give entrepreneurs a lot is just about looking at the incentives for who you get into your round. So I was talking to someone about this week. A startup that we're looking at, she just got a term sheet from a strategic, and it's for a seed fund. And so she has I can't say what the space is. She has a really cool startup, and she potentially could raise $1 million from a strategic investor. But that's almost one of the most worst things, actually, that she could do, because at that early stage, they would then, this can parlay itself in 2 ways. One is the investor who gives you money just as an option to get into your next round. So the $700 million fund who writes you a seed check. So, or the strategic investor who gives you money because they're interested in your space and presumably they would buy you someday. So as an entrepreneur, it's really important for you to have relationships with both of those people, but not necessarily for you to take money from them the first time around. Because again, in that like middle case scenario where you get to your next round and they don't invest or they don't buy you, they have all the information about you. So everyone else in the market, you basically run a signaling risk. Everyone else in the market assumes that they know everything about you. And so if they don't want you, why should they? So sometimes, and so if a really big fund is writing you a check, they're writing 10 checks for, $250,000. It doesn't, that's no skin off of their back because they have $700 million to give away. And then they pick the best 2 to invest in at the next round. So where does that leave the other 8 companies in that cohort? We've definitely been in the position, so what we do is that we only do seed, we won't do later rounds. And so that means that we help you sell your seed, or we help you sell your A. So a lot of times we're in the position where we're helping entrepreneurs try and raise that next round and fighting the signaling that has happened because they got someone who seemed on the surface like they were going to be really helpful, but then didn't end up being as helpful, and ends up making them look terrible for everyone else. So that's something, another thing that I definitely don't think first-time entrepreneurs know about.
Talk about some of the interesting deals that you had the chance to work with, some interesting names with Founder Collective, or maybe a good anecdote about how that came about, how the relationship with those companies.
Sure. So I'm the most technical person on my team. So this has the positive and the negative that right now I look at almost every single thing that we're looking at, which means that sometimes I have a week where I look at 40 companies, and then I'll walk around the next week like with my eyes glazed. But we just get to see a lot of really interesting stuff. So while I've been there, I've worked on almost all the companies we've invested in. Some of the interesting ones, we just did a dog DNA testing company. We did a really cool startup that lets hourly employees trade shifts with each other on their phones. In a lot of retail environments or hourly environments, like people were using WhatsApp and like texting to sort of like talk to their managers or things like that. Or sometimes you could trade shifts with someone, but if you did, then you wouldn't be in the system to clock in. And so then you'd get there and you couldn't get paid or clock in because it wasn't connected to the payroll system. So they fixed that so that you could actually trade shifts with people. So that was a cool company that we did. We've done a couple of sort of local, like people that, we did a bunch of HubSpot veterans who started a company called Crayon. It was another one.
You had the experience of both getting education here in Boston, working with your company, now helping entrepreneurs. What would you say is the biggest change you've seen in the startup ecosystem, and what are some of the positive things and the things to be careful about? There's a big explosion of opportunities, but how have you seen that landscape change in all these years?
Well, I think it's awesome that there's been there was an earlier generation of Boston startups, and I think that's still here, but now there's sort of been, since like 2005, there have been another generation of startups that have grown up here, and the alums are starting to found companies, and I think the ecosystem here, there are a ton of resources for people who want to start companies, like everything from the Engine to Bolt to Techstars to Mass Challenge to Learn Launch for EdTech companies to, there are a couple of healthcare accelerators, incubators, you're involved with one. And so I think there's really a lot of resources here. In my office today, we were kind of laughing because there was a a news story about a company which just moved from the West Coast to Boston. And, and so we just thought it was really funny, because usually the stereotype is that people go the other way, which they have. But I think that Boston has a lot to offer in terms of just being more affordable than, say, the Bay Area or even New York, although, it is pretty expensive to live in Boston. But I think some of these things are really contributing to making it a place where you can experiment, you can get the resources to experiment. And so I think we're poised at the beginning of we see so many amazing companies in Boston.
And what's getting you excited about what you're seeing here in Boston, like being exposed in the last time? Are you seeing a trend in a particular type of technology or industry? Or we've seen a lot about, augmented reality and artificial intelligence, but are there something that touches you that you're seeing that is interesting in a special way for you?
I really feel like we've seen things, I probably see more companies that are based on like trying to build a brand, and that's their key value proposition coming out of New York. There was a month where I'd looked at 3 self-driving car technology companies that had come out of MIT and Harvard and BU. We see 3D printing companies here, or that I don't think you see in other parts of the country. They're definitely, we don't happen to do life sciences or healthcare, but like that I think is stronger here than almost anywhere else. What I would say the most positive signs that I see is that I do see people who are trying to build a consumer brand here or trying to build a direct-to-consumer company here. I don't know that people had that confidence before. And I just am encouraged by the diversity and also by like the really young entrepreneurs who are building really cool stuff.
So with that segue into young entrepreneurs, and maybe not so young, but that are in the audience, I just want to open it for questions. So please, if anybody has anything for Parul, then I'll walk around with the microphone and so it's recorded.
Yeah, hi. You mentioned that you typically look for 500 customers in a startup?
I wouldn't say that. I would just say that if you take 5 out of the last, several of the last companies that we looked at, one of them, Blissfully, what they had done was that they built a product and they got 500, or Crayon actually, they built a product, they made it freemium, and they got 500 people signed up, or 500 companies signed up for their enterprise freemium product. So, but to us, that was an indicator that they knew how to get those. But another company that we looked at, WorkJam, well, they were exceptional as well. I'm clearly saying this is exceptional. Like these companies were exceptional, but then we wanted to invest in the exceptional ones. They had gotten one really big company as their first customer, and so they had kind of nailed that down. We also invested last fall in a company called Neuromotion, which their product, they're sort of still in beta. They don't have they don't have paying customers yet. We were in Get Human from last summer. I think they were pretty early when we invested as well. I think it really varies. I wouldn't say that you need to have 500 customers. I think that's an absolutely specific to your company type of metric. Like, who are you targeting? The question is more, how can I show you that I know how to get customers? That's pretty much the question. Like, show me that you know how to get your customers. How much does it cost you? What are the economics around you getting customers? Because VCs are looking for companies that can scale a lot. And after a certain point, if you're putting a quarter in every time you need to get a customer, and you're trying to get hopefully more than a dime out, or you're getting money back out, that's important. And so what are the dynamics of the opportunity that you're looking at or you're targeting look like? Like, do you need to pay to acquire every single customer? Is there any, are you, I don't know, a team that's amazing at getting customers definitely is going to get sort of extra credit. I didn't actually let you ask a question, so I apologize for that. But I'm happy to answer another one if you have it.
Thanks for your wonderful presentation. I would like to know what is the process in terms of approaching the startups you guys funded. What was the process? Did they come to you or did you guys go to them? Did they, for example, did they submit a business plan or did they do a pitch? That's what I'm trying to understand. Thanks.
A lot of startups come to us by way of introduction. So they get an introduction to us. You know, I mean, you, like on LinkedIn, you can see if you're connected to someone, and so they find someone to make an introduction. That helps because then we basically know you a little bit more than we know like a random person off the street. So that's a little bit of extra signal. We actually do look at all the business plans that we get just sent to us as well. So people, we have invested in companies where they've just sent us, they've just reached out to us cold. We do reach out to companies on occasion, but we get so much volume at the moment. We don't spend a ton of our energy on that right now. We do usually expect the company to have a pitch deck. So not like a written business plan, but sort of their pitch explaining what they're doing and some of the key metrics around what they've built so far or their team. There's a ton of information on the internet about what's a great pitch deck, so I won't go into that, but we usually start with a conversation around their pitch deck. So if someone sends us something, we'll look at it. If we think it's compelling to have a second conversation, we'll contact them, we'll set up a call with them, we'll talk to them, and then if we continue down that path, then we'll meet with them and do further diligence.
This is kind of a follow-up question to the one he you mentioned viewed as a type of speak through.
So have you worked with incubators because I know investors and incubators partnering up is not an uncommon sort of blended hybrid business model. If they come up to you on what kind of value can they bring to you that would be really, you know?
Well, I think one of the benefits of incubators, so I've been through 2 incubators. I think one of the benefits that they bring to you as an entrepreneur is that, especially for first-time entrepreneurs, there's so much that you don't know. And they sort of help like take away a little bit of that because they help provide you with resources and mentoring and sometimes financing to help kind of take away a little bit of the rookie mistakes. So they also often are kind of giving you structure and coaching, and they don't work with everyone. So they're also sort of like cutting down the pool of, like they're sort of betting on you and your idea. So those are a bunch of the things that you can get out of working with an incubator. We generally will, I mean, I mentored a couple of the incubators. I mentor at Mass Challenge, at Techstars, and at Learn Launch. So we try to be there and help them. And that's another thing a lot of incubators will do. Like they'll try to help connect entrepreneurs to investors and people who have experience in their field early to help. And that's a huge amount of learning for entrepreneurs. Sometimes it would be difficult to get those conversations easily otherwise. And so I think we love working with incubators because we just see the startups as coming out of them. A lot of times it's just being a little bit more sophisticated, knowing how to pitch, like having a sense of a better set of expectations around what should they share with an investor, what should they expect a term sheet to look like. Like some of that, they sort of help you with some of that. They can provide training wheels almost to help you sort of like navigate some of those early issues, which can be annoying to figure out on your own.
Hi, is this working? Hi. What would you say is the time frame for an idea, like if to declare like it's a bad idea or it's a bad investment, or I just should quit what I'm doing and forget about what I thought?
I always tell entrepreneurs, are you potentially an entrepreneur working on something?
I am.
I always tell entrepreneurs that you should not you should not work on an idea unless you can't not work on it. Like, it's keeping you up at night. I think that if you want to work on something just for fun, work on it as a side project. Like, everyone should and can and should do that. But if you need to quit your job to do it full time, it should be because you have rationally convinced yourself that this is an opportunity you absolutely cannot pass up. And ideally, you've convinced other important people in your life that this is worth you taking the risk on, like, family members, maybe other investors. I also think in a lot of cases that it's worthwhile to start something and vet it, or like get some initial proof points before you quit your job, even just moonlighting on it, because once you quit your job, you're sort of starting the clock, right? And the thing is that sometimes with like first customers and even building products, you don't know how long it's going to take to make your first sale. So I had a friend who was deciding whether to quit his job at Google a couple of, about 6 months ago. And I told him, like, under no condition quit your job, because he hadn't gotten any customers. And he was making something for like university educators. And I told him, I wouldn't buy this. And so you need to like keep working on this before when you are actually making enough money to equal your day job revenue, that's a great time to quit. Or if you can convince someone to sort of put some money behind you. Incidentally, I mean, there's, I think, some conflicting advice out there about, like, I think, if you're raising institutional money, you do, and even some angels will want you to be working on it full time before they'll write you a check. But that doesn't mean that you can't start on it on your own and sort of get some proof points to convince them to invest. And I think it's worthwhile to do that, because you put a lot on the line, in terms of financially. So, but good luck with whatever it is that you're working on.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you.